You might be curious about history because there are so many stories about history that we see in the news, so many comparisons with history that we see in the news. So you'd like to learn more about history, but you just don't know where to start. And it's forbidding because, wow, historians produce these big, fat, long books. There's so many dates, so many people, so many cultures, so many places. How on earth can you get on top of all that if you haven't studied history yourself, or if you remember a study of history as tedious and boring with monotonous, tedious lecturers or teachers? I think it's worth getting past that block and realizing that history is actually one of the super skills of the digital Renaissance, just as it was a super skill of the previous Renaissances, whichever culture we're talking about, that looked to the past to learn for the present. History is one of those super skills. And the great thing is you do not need to take a degree in history. You do not need to read 12 volumes of Arnold Toynbee's study of history. You can use your experience and common sense and some basic mindful skills we all have access to become an everyday historian of the digital Renaissance. We need to learn from history, not from historians. And when we realize we can all be everyday historians, we can go about it mindfully. And that's what I'm going to show you in this video. 5 core skills and processes to approach history as an everyday intelligent citizen of the internet, of the global multipolar world. It will help you stay sane in these difficult times, whether it's to make good decisions in your own personal life, your own small world of family and community and workplace or school, or in the big world of global politics, the big public stage of national decision-making, culture and celebrity. Whichever world you're thinking about, history, you can deploy it as a super skill in the digital Renaissance. So the first super skill to get you going as an everyday historian in the digital Renaissance is the skill of story, of narrative. It's realizing the special insights we all gain from telling and hearing stories. Intellectual, cognitive and emotional powers of narrative, the insights of narrative. It's recommended in a great book by James Newstadt and Ernest May called Thinking in Time, The Uses of History for Decision Makers. And what they recommend is when you're confronted with a problem in your life where you're trying to draw a lesson from history, whether it's a big public event or a big personal challenge for you, whether it's to decide whether to negotiate peace or to fight a war, or whether to seek a reconciliation with a friend or continue a feud. The first thing you should do, almost counterintuitively, is not ask what is the problem here. It is to ask what is the story, or even better, what are the stories? Because in any situation, any practitioner of the everyday history of the digital Renaissance will realize every situation has so many complex stories, so many stories from different perspectives. But why is this so important to ask what is the story or the stories rather than what is the problem? Asking what is the problem sees things as, I guess, controllable, almost mechanical sort of situations. They are inputs and outputs, causes and effects, simple relationships, not the chaos of people, not the chaos of history, not the unpredictability, the variability, the unique idiosyncratic character of any good story, of any good history. And so when we ask what is the story, what do? We try to work out, well, what happened here, what happened there, what happened next, who said what did people say in reply. It's to put together a basic issue history about the question you're looking at. And what this does is offer you unique, complex insights that you get from narrative. And this isn't just the sort of fantasy of storytellers and historians who are in love with telling stories of their own making. This is the view from some of the most intelligent and well-informed psychologists and philosophers of our day. The thing about narrative is it brings together the left-hand side of the brain and the right-hand side of the brain and helps us find unique patterns about what is really happening before us. And that's the first super skill that we face as a everyday historian in the digital renaissance. We actually want to find out what is the story, not just what is any old story we might be being told. Whether it's in the media, whether it's by our friends, whether it is even by our crazy old selves. Ian McGilchrist, the author of The Matter of Things, has spoken widely about this, of the importance of story as one of the key ways of thinking and being open to experience. And so that first critical super skill of history in the digital renaissance is asking what is the story, finding out what is the story, and being open to the special insights of narrative. The second great super skill of history is empathy. The thing about stories is, unlike problems, they have characters. There's Vladimir Putin, and there's Joe Biden, and there's Xi Jinping. All of these people have their unique characters, their unique backgrounds, their stories, their friends, their associates, their unpredictable emotional reactions to things. And unless we can get inside the head of the characters in the story is just going to wash over us. So actually using that core personal skill that we all have to some degree and that we can all develop to some degree, that we don't need to go to university, that we don't need to have read long, boring history books about, but we can all employ in different ways, which is empathy. Unless we use that empathy, we won't really get inside history. History is so much, in a way, it's a great way to meet people, to encounter some of the strangest, most inspiring, terrifying, peculiar, entertaining, amusing, tedious, boring, every type of character that has ever lived. And one of the best practical ways that you can actually develop that sense of empathy and that feel for character and individual eccentricity within history is simply to read biographies. Biographies are in some ways a great form of history, and one of the best ways indeed to first make yourself acquainted with a place, a period, a part of history is whether it's actually in the biography, in the individual characteristic reaction of one person to the extraordinary situations that they might encounter. It's the response of the last Mughal emperor to the collapse of Delhi, as it's told in William Dalrymple's story about the collapse of the Mughal empire and the First War of Indian Independence in 1857. One of the super skills of history that we all can have access to is to look out for the individual, to look out for the eccentric and the unexpected all around the world, to look at dictionaries of biography, to look at the small stories of big people and little people, through which the big stories of history always unfold, because history unfolds not just as grand events, as big processes, but as individual responses to individual situations. So empathy and a feel for character is the second super skill of history. The third super skill of history is to understand the sources of the stories we tell ourselves about the past, the sources of the information that we get about the past, and to cultivate what I'm going to call is a mindful attitude of detached awareness about those sources. Now, what I mean by that is traditionally historians are trained in distinguishing between what they call primary sources and secondary sources. Secondary sources are, books like this, the Cambridge History of Russia. It's people's interpretation of events. Primary sources are documents and other sorts of information from the time. They're, direct evidence of what was going on in the past. And in learning history, you are taught how to approach a primary source, and you had to be careful about it because the language was different. You needed to understand the context. When you really got advanced in history, you have to work your way through archives and actually find original documents, some of which people had never read before. And you also needed to try to imaginatively recreate how that document fitted into a process of history. Some of the most wonderful uses of different historical sources have been like using ledger books or even like the rings on trees to work out what have been some of the administrative processes or the patterns of rainfall and climate change that have occurred over time. That was the traditional thing, and there was a very heavy emphasis, I guess, on understanding in a trained, disciplined way how to use those primary sources, and frankly that probably scares most people today off from the idea of doing history because, well, it's hard enough to understand how we talk to each other today, let alone how to work out how people were talking to each other 500 years ago. But things are changing now, and in addition, there's a much bigger range of sources available, and there's less focus on written documents and more focus on images and costume and archaeology and all sorts of scientific data as well. And there was an important skill about that, which was to be really focused on seeing that original primary source document as the voice of the past, let's say. It was the voice of the past which we were really carefully attending to make sure that we didn't just impose our preconceptions, the interpretations that we've already got in our heads, or our 21st century attitudes to. We wanted to actually imagine that through that document, through that painting, through that piece of pottery, all that piece of scientific evidence, that we can actually speak again to the dead people of the past, and we had to be really careful about it. Most people simply don't have the time or the patience, or aren't necessarily approaching history in that way of trying to collect original evidence about the past, but they're still interested in the past. So there is still something, I think, that you can really bring from that differentiation between primary sources and secondary sources to an everyday practice of history. And I think that is actually immersing yourself in the actual experience of the past, but with a detached awareness, so that you don't get caught up either in your preconceptions or in your overexcited speculation about what the past was like, that you try to observe it as much as possible as it actually was. L.P. Hartley famously said in the Go-Between novel that, the past is a foreign country. People do things differently there. But I don't think, in a way, in today's world, given so many of us have travelled to so many foreign countries, so many of us speak more than one language, so many of us are exposed to the cultures all around the world on the internet, I don't think that should be such a high barrier to trying to reach out to immerse yourself in the actual experience of the past, to actually look yourself at what people in the past said. Don't just read historians on history, but try to explore yourself some of these older texts, some of these older paintings, some of this older individual imaginative experience that has come down to us in the world's cultural heritage. But you need to do so with a kind of detached awareness. In a way, it's almost as if the past is a massive open world game and you're exploring it, picking up what is really the story there. So understanding the sources of the stories that we tell each other about the past and practicing a detached awareness about them, that is the third super skill of history. The fourth super skill of history is a bit more analytical. It's not just imagination, it's not just storytelling, it's not just empathy. It's actually getting a little bit analytical about comparing and contrasting what the past was really like to what our mental models, our assumed stories about the past was. We all want to avoid fake news. We also all want to avoid fake history. And there are ubiquitous historical models and comparisons all over the place that inform how we go about our lives, that shape the stories we assume about how people act in the world. I'm using a historical model in this very video because I'm talking about the digital renaissance. I'm drawing a historical comparison between a highly argued about period of European history, somewhere between the 14th and the 17th century, where people looked to the classical Roman and Greek, classical European Mediterranean world and learnt from history. But that idea has also applied to other cultures as well. And I'm drawing the comparison between that and a sort of a new blooming of knowledge that people are referring to in today with the boon of internet technology and low entry platforms like YouTube, which is the digital renaissance. So that comparison may or may not be valid. It may be just a bit of a metaphor. But one of the super skills you need to practice as an everyday historian of the digital renaissance is to get a little bit analytical about so many of these historical comparisons and not just get carried away with comparing every war with World War II, every authoritarian or unpleasant political leader with the sort of authoritarian leaders that emerged in Europe in the 1930s and 1920s. And there is a great technique recommended in James Newsat and Ernest May's Thinking in Time to do this. And that is to draw up a little comparison between your situation and your assumed historical comparison. Let's say it's a current war and World War II, and to do two things: to work out what is known, unknown, and presumed in the situation. Now, you may have more or less knowledge about this. This isn't asking you to do a big research essay. This is just a basic sense check of what do you really know, or what are you just assuming about the situation. Do you really know the motives of someone? Do you really know what their objectives are? All that sort of thing. And then the second thing is to say, what are the likenesses and differences between your situation and your comparison, your historical comparison? Is the fighting in the war you're thinking about on the same scale as World War II? Is it more? Is it less? Are more countries involved? Are less countries involved? Are different kind of weapons involved? Are there different stated political objectives? All that sort of thing. And these two techniques of working out what's known, unknown, and presumed helps you get a lot clearer around what you really know, how much of the story you're really more making up with assumptions and stories that you're telling yourself. and what perhaps you need to find out more about to really understand a situation well. And also, it helps you get a lot more nuance and sophistication and precision about how things are similar and different. And by doing both of those things, fundamentally, we see the situation better, more clearly as it really is, so that we can make the right kind of decision that's suited to this unique situation. And that is so important if we want to use history to make better decisions, to use history to stay sane in our troubled world, whether it's our personal lives, our family and community lives, or the big world of global politics. Okay, the fifth super skill in history is to observe patterns in time, to think in flows of time. This is the phrase used by Neustadt in May in their book Thinking in Time. And this boils down to pattern recognition of causes, consequences, but also a little bit of chaos and unpredictability. As they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, and perhaps it only rhymes because we make it rhyme. The patterns in history are very complicated, and we can often place upon a very chaotic, unique, individual, idiosyncratic situation some pattern that may not be there, because our minds are pattern-seeking machines. We see patterns even when they are not there. And the three big things that you're so often asked to look at in history are: what caused this, or what are the multiple causes of this event? What are the consequences of this event? What was the consequence of the Treaty of Versailles for the later political circumstances of Europe in the 1920s and 1930s? What were the economic consequences of the peace? And what is a result of chance and unpredictability and wayward individual responses? Would world history have been different if the weather in 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia, would it have been different if the weather had been a little bit less unfriendly to Napoleon that year? Would history have been different if Cleopatra had been a little bit less attractive when the Roman guy Mark Antony met her that first time? All sorts of unpredictable, erratic reactions perhaps could have determined the fate of history. So being able to think through carefully and subtly what are the patterns of cause, consequence, but also chance and chaos is really one of the key super skills of history. In some ways, this goes back to what Ian McGilchrist was saying, that what some of the thinking patterns that I was referring to from Ian McGilchrist earlier in the video, of bringing left and right hand side, the left and right hand side of the brain together to form a holistic judgment about things, to be open to experience, to not being too close-minded, to not foreclose judgment too early, to try to see things as they are, but then also to try to imaginatively project how things might unfold, both in response to clear facts, but also the back and forward of character and conflict within a story, but also the unpredictable chance collisions of events and circumstances that sometimes just lead to situations changing, and having and developing a feel for the perception of those patterns of cause, consequence and chance in the flow of time in history. That is one of the great super skills of history, which fundamentally I think goes to the idea of judgment and making good judgments in the decisions of our lives. So they're the 5 core super skills of history: story, empathy, having a detached awareness of different sources of information, comparing and contrasting historical models with real situations so that you can avoid fake history, and observing the patterns in time, whether they are causes, consequences, chance or chaos, so that you can make the right judgments in the decisions that you are making. Those 5 core skills will help you practice everyday history, whether it's reading the news, whether it's making sense of your personal life, whether it's thinking about the big events of the world, whether it's just going with your curiosity about different times, different places, and different cultures. So don't be afraid of history. Don't be deterred by history. The past is sure, it's a foreign country, but we're all used to getting connected to foreign countries these days. So let's use those 5 skills. And the other thing is, you can build a reading list to go a bit deeper into history. And it's not just reading very, very long books. On my channel, on the Burning Archive channel, I make recommendations about some of the best books from historians today that really help you understand the world. So check out some of those videos. There are also great podcasts like the Empire podcast and great other video channels about history on YouTube. And there are many wonderful online sources, and I'll have some more information about those soon. In fact, what I'm planning to do is to release an online course about my approach to mindful history for the everyday historian in the digital renaissance, or is it the digital reformation maybe? If you'd like to find out more about that course, you can join my free weekly newsletter at jeffrich.substack.com. That's Jeff with a J. You'll hear about that new course, and if there are things you'd like to see in that course, leave me a comment below.